Stories about trolls first emerged in the Scandinavian countries, and each had its own. Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish, and later they appeared even in the distant Faroe Islands. And the biggest trolls come from Iceland. According to legends, these creatures have always frightened the locals with their appearance and witchcraft abilities. They lived everywhere, in castles, underground palaces, caves, forests, or under bridges. People had much to fear. Some hostile trolls were dangerous enemies, strong and cruel. They caused a lot of torment and misery to villagers, lured people to their deaths, or stole sleeping babies from their beds. The troll is an insidious trickster who lives in constant darkness and attacks defenseless settlements at night. In Norway, it was believed that trolls are strikingly different from each other in appearance and character. Some of them are giants, others are tiny creatures. Some are friendly to humans, others, on the contrary, burn them with real anger. But they also share some common features, at least in appearance. A large hooked nose, 4 fingers on each hand and foot, disheveled hair, and a tail that looks more like a cow's. Trolls can also take the form of a dog, a black goat, or a friendly man with a tail. On the heads of monsters, in addition to hair, usually grow moss, grass, bushes, and even trees. And sometimes there were different numbers of heads. The more heads, the older the troll. And not only older, but also more attractive, as the abundance of heads lured the creatures of the female sex, which in Norway were called gugras. The longevity of trolls remains a mystery. They lived in the dense Norwegian and Swedish forests. They had relatives. In Iceland, they were called trolls there, as well as on the Shetland and Orkney Islands. Trolls hid their dwellings in mountain caves, inside hills, rock mounds, and even in burrows underground. Some preferred to live alone, sometimes occupying the space of an entire mountain, while others formed families or joined tribes. Some trolls formed kingdoms with a clear hierarchy and vertical authority. They built huge underground complexes with palaces and a system of labyrinths, such as in the Dovre Mountains, where the famous Peer Gynt, the hero of the play of the same name by Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen, visited. In their caves, mountain trolls hid untold treasures, gold and precious stones, and were very fond of bragging to people about their accumulated wealth. According to legend, on the darkest nights, they would raise their crystal palaces on golden columns to the surface and roll out huge chests, opening them and slamming the lids shut in an attempt to attract the attention of random travelers. Though one would hardly want to see them, eyes wide open, mouths wide open, noses swollen, sniffing for human scent. The trolls who lived under bridges were a specialty. As a rule, they were loners who built a bridge for themselves and charged anyone who wanted to cross it. They differed from their fellow creatures in their indifference to the sun's rays. The only way to kill these creatures was to destroy their bridge, a carefully guarded shrine. There is also a belief that trolls can sometimes leave an old bridge to start building a new one. It happened on an early winter morning in 1975. Spouses Barry and Elaine were traveling with their 2 young children to the village of Slitting Mill in Staffordshire, UK. They were returning home after Christmas holidays spent in the neighboring town of Penkridge. Suddenly, the engine of their car began to make a loud noise and then stopped. The couple and their children were stranded on an empty road in a wooded area in an inoperable car, which they barely managed to roll to the side of the road. Barry didn't consider himself a good mechanic, but he did open the hood of the car and started looking around. But at first glance, there was nothing to indicate that there was any breakdown. The nearest houses were no more than a mile away, and Barry decided he would have to get there on foot. We had a picnic blanket in the trunk, and I pulled it out. Then I went back to Elaine, who was sitting with our 2 kids, ages 4 and 6, who were still napping, and threw a blanket over them. I then told them to stay seated in the car, and I would go into town, find some other vehicle, and come back for them as soon as possible. The car will have to be left here and a mechanic will be called tomorrow. And at that moment, Elaine, who had looked at the road behind her husband's back, cried out loudly in fear. She saw a small creature run across the road not far from them. It was moving very fast, and Barry did not see it until it was almost over the curb. It was only at the last second that I saw it, but after it came another one, and then a third. It's hard for me to describe what they looked like, but it was a rather hairy troll. It was early morning, and the moon was hanging over the road, and we could see these creatures clearly in the moonlight. They looked like little men with humps on their backs and large downward curved noses. They had no clothes on, but their bodies were covered with long hair. I'd say they were each about 4 feet, 1.2 meters, tall, and as the last one ran across the road, the others were standing on the side of the road near the woods, looking at it, I thought, warily. Barry recalls the rest of the details of the encounter with great difficulty. It was all a blur. He remembers that these creatures, after crossing the road, walked very slowly towards the people and looked at them as if they were interested in the appearance of the people. They moved so slowly as if they were sneaking up on their prey, so Elaine became hysterical at the sight of it. The children began to cry, and Barry himself admits that he was close to the same state. And that's all we remembered. What happened then none of us can remember, though as it turned out almost 2 hours had passed, and our car suddenly started up again. But we definitely remember that these creatures were there. Barry says that he and his wife are now in their 60s, but they still feel uncomfortable recalling the event, and they still don't remember how their encounter with the hairy trolls ended. But we know what we're talking about. These things happened and we remember them. The children, fortunately, didn't remember anything, but we do remember details of what they looked like. They all had hair. They were something like trolls or goblins, and they were completely real. Neither Elaine nor I ever encountered anything paranormal again afterward, but the event was forever etched in our hearts. This story has another fascinating detail. The village of Slitting Mill and nearby Penkridge appear in several other eyewitness accounts as places where people have seen large, hairy humanoid creatures, British Bigfoots. On February 18, 1995, near Slitting Mill, a woman named Jackie Hogton saw a huge, clumsy creature covered in hair from her car. Jackie even had to turn the steering wheel sharply to the side. She almost collided with this giant when he suddenly stepped into the road only 6 meters away from the car. And considering that the woman was driving at high speed, it's a miracle that she did not hit the outlandish creature. Tall, thickly covered with hair, with 2 glowing red eyes. According to Jackie Hogton, it quickly disappeared among the trees. And 3 more years later, in September 1998, there was another encounter. The people who drove the car at night later said that the creepy animal was large, man-like, 2 meters tall, and leaned slightly forward when moving. Its legs are twice as thick as human legs, its fur a dark blackish brown, and as this forest man passed by, it turned its head toward the car for a moment and looked right at the people. In December 2003, local newspapers published a story told by a young man named Craig. Toth encountered a large ape-like creature near the town of Penkridge. Is it possible that the hairy trolls seen by Barry and Elaine were children of these local Bigfoots, or are they creatures of another species? Aria grew up in a small village called Glenville. In this village lived simple people who were farmers. Aria's family lived in an old cottage that had been in need of repair for a long time. The girl's father's name was Jake. He was a kind and caring father, but misfortune did not bypass him and he died of cancer, leaving the family penniless. Aria's mom, whose name was Ellie, worked from morning till night on the farm to feed the family. The family didn't have enough money for anything, sometimes having to make do with bread and water. Her maternal grandmother, whose name was Margaret, was the only source of warmth and comfort for Aria. She told her granddaughter old fairy tales and taught her how to bake the most delicious pies. One day, Grandma started to feel sick and her mom called an ambulance. Aria stood by her side, not knowing what to do, and tried to soothe and comfort her grandmother. But magic words and affectionate touches didn't help. Her grandmother died of suffocation, and it was a difficult experience for Aria. That day, the house became quiet and empty. Aria was left alone with her mom, but the feeling of loss never left her. She realized that now she would have to be strong and cope with all the problems herself, but she didn't lose hope and believed that things would change for the better in the future. The day her grandmother died, Aria felt a strong desire to become a doctor. Aria realized that if she knew how to give first aid to her grandmother, she might have been able to save her. From that moment on, Aria decided that she would study and become a doctor to save lives and help people. She realized that it would not be an easy path, but she was ready for difficulties and trials. That night, sitting by the window and looking at the stars, Aria vowed to herself that she would fight for her dream of becoming a doctor to save lives and prevent the loss she experienced with her grandmother. Every day, Aria studied hard. read books about medicine, helped her mom on the farm, and dreamed of a future where she could help people and make their lives better. Although there may have been difficulties and obstacles on the way to her dream, Arya was confident that she could overcome all challenges and become a doctor to save lives. After successfully passing her exams and getting into medical school, Arya studied hard without wasting a minute of time. She was one of the brightest and most talented students. She had high grades and a great passion for medicine. After graduating from university and earning her medical degree, Arya decided to return to her village to help her mother and other residents. She got a job at the local hospital, where she became a valued specialist and everyone's favorite doctor. Arya organized free medical consultations for those in need, prevented various diseases, and treated every patient with respect. Her mom was proud of her daughter and helped Arya in her noble cause, supporting and inspiring her every day. The family felt the house filled with warmth and joy with Arya's return. Arya sat at the desk in the medical office and looked out the window at the green meadows beyond. Suddenly, the door opened and a panting boy burst into the room with eyes full of terror. "Arya, I saw a monster in the swamp. It looks like a man, but it has a lizard head and a long tail," shouted the boy, barely breathing. Arya stared at him with her serious eyes and asked, "Are you sure you're not confused? Monsters only happen in fairy tales and movies." But the boy insisted on his words. "I saw him. I was running away when he appeared from behind the trees. You need to do something about this, Arya." Arya thought for a moment, then took the boy's hand and said, "Take it easy, dear. I'll check it out for myself. Don't worry, everything will be fine." She asked the boy to describe to her the exact spot where he had seen this monster, and went to the swamp to verify the information. As Arya approached the place where the boy said, but saw nothing, Arya ended up in the library a few days after the monster in the swamp incident. She was walking between shelves of books when suddenly her gaze fell on one book with the mysterious title, Reptoid. She couldn't help herself and took the book with her to read at home. After conducting her duties at the hospital, Arya sat down in her cozy corner and began to read. Page after page, she immersed herself in the fascinating world of fantastical creatures, and lo and behold, she came across a chapter describing creatures called reptoids. These creatures lived in deep forests and swamps, had a lizard-like skull, and their bodies were covered with scales similar to those of reptiles. Arya realized that the description of the monster from the boy's story matched the description of the reptoids. She deducted some useful information. They are forced to take on a human appearance so as not to frighten the population. Reptiloids, by the way, are creatures that are related in some ways to our lizards and crocodiles. This is where the name came from. They have cold blood, have tails, claws, and sharp teeth. But things like conscience, compassion, humor are not available to them. Reptiloid aliens have the following features: taller than average, brightly and G. They have rubbery sexual features, insensitivity to heat, extraordinary physical strength, strange eyes with narrow pupils. They look nothing like humans, but they can transform their form to look almost human. A reptiloid is a non-human creature with petal-sharp skin covered in scales, resembling a giant lizard or dragon. His eyes emit fiery rays. He has supernatural strength and speed, the ability to shapeshift and penetrate walls. His cruel mind and aggressive behavior make him deadly to anyone who happens to be near him. Its goal is to control and subjugate humanity, and it is willing to do anything to achieve that goal. Its presence fills the air with an ominous aura of terror, and anyone who meets its gaze feels that the apocalypse has arrived. Arya, after reading the description of reptiloids in the book, felt mixed feelings. On the one hand, she was surprised that there appeared to be such strange creatures resembling monsters from fairy tales. On the other hand, she thought, none of this could be true. After all, the reptiloids are just a fairy tale, a fantasy creature, and it probably has nothing to do with the real world. Arya decided that it was better not to believe in such stories and to continue living her normal life, dedicating herself to her work and helping people. Arya got up early in the morning to make it to town in time to get the medicine she needed. Her plans were a little disrupted by the canceled bus, but she was not discouraged and decided to walk through the swamps. The road wasn't the easiest, but Arya wasn't afraid of hardship. Hearing sounds from the back, she turned around. Arya looked in the direction of the sound of the engine with surprise and saw a brand new foreign car slowly pulling up to her. The driver of the car opened the window and asked if she needed help. Arya happily agreed to the offer and gratefully got into the car. It was warm and cozy inside. The soft leather seats and the pleasant aroma of the car immediately made Arya feel comfortable. Arya felt a bit uneasy when she heard a strange sound in the driver's speech, reminiscent of a snake. She tried to ignore it and continued the conversation, asking him about his profession and why he was in the neighborhood. However, the longer they talked, the more Arya got the feeling that something was wrong with this man. His eyes were too bright and piercing, as if they were sparkling with snake fire. And every time he finished a word, a low hissing sound reminiscent of a snake was heard. Arya felt her intuition saving her, and she decided not to relax and stay alert. As the conversation continued, Arya noticed that the man's appearance was too perfect. His face was without a single wrinkle, without a single pimple, as if it were a mask of perfection. The skin of his face was too white, as if he had never been in the sunlight. His gaze was fixed on her, as if he was trying to hypnotize her with his bright eyes. Arya sensed that something was wrong and began to worry. She tried to remain calm and continue the conversation, but her instincts told her to be wary. At that moment, the man suddenly turned his head toward her, his lips curved into a smile, but it was some kind of alien, eerie smile. Suddenly, the car slowed noticeably, beginning to shake and make strange noises. The driver took the keys out of the ignition and opened the hood to see what was wrong. Arya felt a lot of anxiety watching his actions. The driver concluded that there was an engine problem and he wouldn't be able to keep going. He offered Arya to wait for him here until he resolved the car problem. Arya firmly refused his offer, sensing that something was wrong with this man. "I'm sorry, but I won't wait here. I have a very important matter and I need to get to the city urgently. I'd rather walk," I said firmly, looking him straight in the eye. But the driver insisted, too rude and insistent. "You're staying here until I fix the car. You have nowhere to rush, and I'll definitely come back for you." I felt goosebumps run down my skin, and my instincts told me that this was an unusual situation. I was wary, and said firmly that I knew how to take care of myself and would rather walk. Her breathing was heavy and ragged, but she kept running without stopping. Gradually, the monster stayed behind, breathing deeply and looking around to make sure the danger was over. Arya realized that she had been through a real nightmare, and that reptiloids existed for real, not just in fairy tales and movies. She realized that this encounter would change her life forever, and her determination to become a doctor to help people only grew stronger. She knew there were forces of evil and danger in the world, and she needed to be prepared for them. Arya quickly made it to the nearest village, where she called the police and described the incident in detail. She described the man, his car, and any strange details she noticed. The police assigned a search and began to investigate. When the car with the man was not found, everyone was shocked. Arya, as a doctor, was a respected member of her community, and she was believed without question. She was sure it was a reptiloid, and she was prepared to prove it by any means necessary. The locals were shocked by the event and supported Arya in her beliefs. They were grateful for her bravery and determination. But the search was fruitless, and the car with the man remained on the side of the road as a mute witness to the mysterious accident. Even though the reptiloid could never be found, Arya was certain that it existed. She became more alert and cautious, knowing that there were dangers in the world that needed to be considered. Her experience was a reminder that doctors not only heal bodies but also fight dark forces, protecting their patients from evil and pain. Although the mystery of the reptiloid remained unsolved, Arya was convinced that there are more things in this world than we can imagine. She continued her work as a doctor, helping people and bringing them hope and healing. Her determination and courage made her a true hero in the eyes of her community, and she was willing to fight for the well-being and safety of all who needed her help. So a few years ago on March 8th, Seema and her friends decided to meet and celebrate the holiday. The place for the picnic was chosen near the town of Bogorodsk, Nizhny Novgorod region. Imagine, early spring, the snow is lying in high drifts. Closer to the forest, it was covered with waist-high snow, but the friends were lucky. They saw an exit from the highway to a flat spot. Apparently, there was road equipment there, so the snow was cleared. It turned out to be quite cozy here, and it was close to the forest, not far from the road, and there was no one around. They took out appetizers, a little wine. Important point, the company is sober, the driver did not take alcohol at all, the ladies symbolically for the holiday. The goal was to meet and socialize, talking, joking, and congratulating. They didn't notice how the evening crept up. We slowly started to go home. Around the beauty, fields in the distance and the village lights lit up. The forest is still snowy. Suddenly they see a man walking along the highway and kind of turns to them. Friends began to speculate. Oh, look, someone seems to have gotten lost out there. Why would he go to the forest at night? No, he's probably coming to us. Maybe his car broke down. Or asking for a ride. Blink his headlights, someone suggested to the driver. The driver blinked, and in the light of the headlights, the company saw that the man stood still for a moment and then rushed away from the road and ran toward the forest. He ran, he didn't run. His speed was inhuman considering that the snow was above his knees. Besides, it became clear to everyone that the stranger's height was not less than 2 and more meters. Without a word, the whole group rushed into the car, and the driver sped off with his foot on the floor. How long will it take him to come up behind us and attack us? We drove home at the maximum authorized speed, almost did not talk, and only looked out the window to see if a huge figure was rushing along the field parallel to the car. The car accelerated sharply, moving through the slippery snow. Everything around seemed smeared and unclear, and the heart was pounding so hard as if it would jump out of the chest. Suddenly, the car skidded, and the driver could not cope with the control. Instantly, everything happened. The car jumped out of the road, flew a few meters, and crashed into a tree. The impact was brutal. Everyone around them seemed to freeze. The window shattered, making scratchy noises. Branches were flying everywhere, and darkness enveloped the car. The driver, Eric, suffered serious head injuries. Blood was quickly pouring down his face, but he was still conscious. The friends, frightened and stunned, climbed out of the car and rushed towards him. Panic gripped them, but they needed to act urgently. They tried to stop the bleeding by pressing something that resembled first aid supplies to the wound. Seema, shaking with fear and, of course, the terrible accident, pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and tried to call the emergency services. But alas, in the sweltering field not far from the forest, communication was almost non-existent. He tried raising his hand and holding the phone as close to the sky as possible in hopes of getting a signal. But the effort was futile, and he was just about to climb down from the tree when he suddenly picked up a faint signal. "Hang on, friends, I'm going to try to make a call," shouted down to his companions who were still trying to help the accident-stricken driver. Seema tried dialing the emergency number again, and this time it took an especially great effort to keep the phone in the working area. His heart was pounding even harder when he heard the distant voice of the operator on the other end of the wire. Asterisk, emergency services, what's your problem? He heard the operator's voice say. We've been in an accident. We need immediate help. We are near the town of Bogorodsk, in a field near the forest, Seema shouted, trying to give the operator his coordinates. But the connection stopped with 2 long beeps. It was completely. We gathered enough wood to make a fire and headed back to the car. On the way back, we discussed what to do next. When we got back to the car, we saw that Edith was still in bad shape. We made a fire and covered Edith with a blanket and waited for help to arrive. The night was cold and dark, but we knew that together we could survive any ordeal. We kept talking, joking, holding each other's hands so we wouldn't lose hope. The night was long and tense. Lisa and I took turns staying with Edith to monitor his condition and provide him with the help he needed. The light from the fire flickered, casting shadows on the trees around us, creating an atmosphere of mystery and enigma. We tried to quiet our fears by telling each other different stories, joking around, and trying to keep an upbeat spirit. But knowing that somewhere in the darkness lurked that mysterious figure seen on the road made us anxious and worried. We listened to every rustle, every barking of neighboring animals, every noise from the wind, and our hearts beat harder and harder. The night seemed like an eternity, and we waited for help to arrive, realizing that it was our only chance to survive and return home. Seema realized that they needed to find more firewood to keep the fire going and keep warm. He decided to go for firewood in the woods, taking Lisa with him. They took lanterns and a small spear to protect themselves in case of danger. Seema was determined and fearless. Despite all the threats of the forest and the mysterious events of the previous night, they moved in silence, following the tracks on the snowy path, the lantern light reflecting off the snowy hills and giving an indistinct illumination. Lisa was tense. She felt that they shouldn't leave the camp for too long. Seema moved decisively. He confidently chose the path, guided by his instincts and experience. Suddenly they heard a strange noise behind their backs, and both of them stopped on the spot. Asterisk. What was that? Lisa whispered, turning her gaze to the pitch blackness of the forest. Asterisk? I don't know, but we should be more careful, Seema said, putting his arm around the girl's shoulder. They moved on, but every rustle, every smell, every movement put them on alert and vigilant. They gathered some large firewood and decided to head back to camp, not risking staying in the forest any longer. On the way back, Lisa couldn't forget about the mysterious figure they had seen on the road the day before. She felt that someone was watching them, and they couldn't relax even for a minute. When they returned to the camp, they found that everything was in its place, but the atmosphere was tense and filled with fear. They lit a fire to ward off the darkness and ominous shadows, but Lisa still could not rest. Seema sat by the fire, carefully observing the world around him. It had been a long night, and he began to feel fatigue coming over him. His eyes began to droop, his thoughts began to drift, and his strength waned, but he dared not let himself rest, for the safety of his friends depended on him. He still sat staring into the fire, trying to stay awake, but the fatigue was stronger, and after a while his eyes closed, and in his head sounded one thought, just for a moment, just for a moment. Seema was suddenly awakened by a strange growl coming from far away. His heart sank with fear, and he opened his eyes, scarcely realizing what was happening. And now, in front of him, recognizable in the twilight of the forest, stood a huge yeti, a creature from legends and scary stories. Seema couldn't believe his eyes. A huge yeti stood before him, his muscular body covered in thick fur that covered every inch of him. Its eyes were red like glowing embers, and they glittered in the darkness of the forest, emitting a terrifying light. Its teeth were razor-sharp and white against its black muzzle. Huge paws, armed with sharp claws, seemed ready to tear everything around him to pieces. The yeti was making loud growling sounds that resembled the roar of thunder, which made Seema shiver in fear. He realized that he was face to face with the creature from his worst nightmares, and realizing this made his heart beat even faster. Seema was paralyzed with terror as he stared at the yeti, which was slowly approaching him with an ominous snarl. But suddenly, the last remnants of his will to survive took over, and he screamed with all his might, letting out a cry of despair and fear. His voice echoed in the silence of the forest, reflecting his powerless resistance in front of the terrifying creature. But the yeti didn't stop, and in the next instant, he delivered a powerful blow to Seema's head with his huge paw. Seema lost consciousness. Seema's scream woke Lisa and Eddick, and they ran out of the tent to see what was happening. They saw a terrifying sight, a yeti dragging Seema by the leg into the darkness of the forest. The creature was huge and terrifying, its muscular body glistening in the faint light of the campfire and its eyes glowing bright red lights. Lisa and Eddick screamed in horror as they saw their friend dragged into the forest. They knew they had to act quickly to save him. Without thinking, they started throwing everything they had at hand at Bigfoot. They threw wood, rocks, cans of canned food, anything that could hurt the creature. Bigfoot stopped for a moment. This gave Lisa and Eddick a chance to get closer to Seema, who was lying unconscious on the ground. They grabbed him and tried to pull him away from the yeti, who was already approaching them again. They continued to back away, never taking their eyes off the horrible creature. Bigfoot was furious, his eyes glittering with rage, and he was ready to attack anyone who got in the way of his prey. When a headlight showed in the distance, the yeti turned with a sudden movement and darted deep into the forest, disappearing from sight. Seema, Lisa, and Eddick were shocked at what had happened. But thanks to their friends and the rescue service, they managed to escape the scary creature. The emergency services were stunned by what had happened. They administered first aid to the injured Sima and then helped the entire trio to the hospital for further evaluation and treatment. Zemo was seriously injured after being hit by the Yeti but was stabilized and under the care of doctors. Lisa and Edik were shocked by the horrible incident they had experienced. It was hard for them to believe that they had encountered a creature from legends, but they are grateful to Sima, who was able to lead them to the rescue. They all owe their lives to the emergency services who arrived at the right time to prevent the tragedy.